In the hush of a medieval night, where pine forests stretched endlessly under a pale northern moon, a people of iron discipline and solemn faith stirred. They were the Teutons, warriors and monks, masons and farmers whose lives were shaped as much by the chill of the Baltic winds as by the weight of the cross they bore. To their enemies, they were relentless horsemen clad in heavy mail, shields painted with stark black crosses. To themselves, they were servants of God, builders of stone fortresses, guardians of order in a world that seemed ever on the edge of chaos. Their story is one of paradox. They came from the wandering tribes of the north, fierce and untamed. Yet they would become famed for castles of meticulous stonework, for monastic vows, and for a code of discipline that rivaled the very stones they raised. The name Teuton evoked both fear and respect across medieval Europe, as their armored knights thundered across the plains of Prussia, while behind their walls the bells of chapels tolled into the frosty dawn. But history is rarely kind. The Teutons, who once seemed unshakable, would themselves face storms greater than any fortress could endure. Pagan tribes, ambitious kings, and rising nations would challenge their might, until their banners grew tattered, and their castles stood as silent witnesses to a forgotten order. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let us walk through the forests of their beginning, past the gates of their mighty castles, hear the hymns sung by their monks, and ride with their knights across frozen rivers. The tale of the Teutons is not merely one of war, but of faith, resilience, and the eternal rise and fall of human ambition. Close your eyes and let the story of the Teutons unfold, like a whispered legend carried on the northern wind. Long before the Teutonic Knights raised their banners across the Baltic, the name Teuton echoed faintly in the mists of antiquity. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century, described tribes in the wild north tall, fair-haired, hardened by forests and snow, dwelling in scattered wooden villages far from the marble roads of Rome. These were the Germanic peoples, restless and fierce, living by the rhythm of the seasons and the spear. Among them, some tribes would come to be remembered as the Teutons. In those early centuries, life was stark but deeply tied to nature. Winters were long and cruel, when families huddled close to smoky hearths, wrapped in furs, telling stories of gods who dwelled in thunder and oak trees. Summers brought war bands gathering under chieftains, setting out across rivers in search of pasture, plunder, or freedom. They fought not for empires, but for survival and honor. To the Romans, they seemed like waves of the untamed north, surging against the frontiers. One story still lingers in the records of Rome: the great migration of the Teutons and the Cimbri, tribes who left their cold homelands and wandered south. For years they swept through Gaul and into Italy, overwhelming legion after legion, until finally they were stopped by the general Marius in 102 BCE. The clash was brutal, the memory enduring. To Rome, Teuton became synonymous with raw strength and untamed ferocity. Yet for the tribes themselves, defeat scattered them back into the shadows of history. absorbed into the vast currents of Germanic migrations. Centuries passed. Rome itself fell. Its legions gone. Its borders erased. The Germanic peoples spread across Europe, founding new kingdoms: Franks in Gaul, Goths in Italy and Spain, Saxons in Britain. The Teutons, though never a single nation, left traces in language, in custom, and in the martial spirit of the North. Over time, Teutonic came to mean Germanic as a whole, a symbol of the hardy peoples who shaped medieval Europe. And yet, the story did not end there. In the Middle Ages, a new order would arise, carrying that ancient name into a very different world. No longer just wandering tribes, the Teutons would become monks and knights, their swords blessed by priests, their fortresses towering over rivers and plains. They would merge faith with war, carving the state from the Baltic wilderness. But here, in their beginnings, they were still children of the forest, bound to the land and the seasons. They prayed to gods of storm and sun, danced around sacred groves, and sang sagas of heroes whose names are long forgotten. They had no castles yet, no written chronicles, only the memory of battles and migrations carried in the voices of their elders. When you close your eyes, you can almost hear them, the creak of leather shields, the chant of warriors before battle, the wind rushing over endless northern pines. This was the first breath of the Teutons, a people on the edge of history, whose name would one day echo through both fear and reverence across all of Europe. From the shadows of early tribes, the Teutons would be reborn in the crucible of the Crusades. It was the late 12th century, and Jerusalem burned with both faith and blood. Pilgrims from every corner of Europe trudged across deserts, many falling to disease, thirst, or sword. Among the German Crusaders, a small brotherhood of knights and priests formed, not only to fight, but to heal. They built a hospital in Acre for the sick and weary, draping their tents in white cloth with bold black crosses. At first, they were humble servants of the sick. Their name, the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, soon to be known simply as the Teutonic Order. What began as a charity quickly hardened into a martial brotherhood, like the Templars and Hospitallers. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they also strapped on swords and armor. In the Holy Land, the Teutonic Knights learned the craft of war, the clash of cavalry, the construction of fortresses, the discipline of men bound not by blood but by faith. Yet Jerusalem was slipping from Christian hands. By the early 13th century, the tides of Islam had swept back much of the Holy Land, and the Teutonic Order looked elsewhere for purpose. Europe was restless, and its kings and popes sought to spread the faith beyond its borders. It was in the pagan wilderness of the Baltic, among the Prussians and Lithuanians, that the Teutonic Knights would find their destiny, summoned by Polish dukes and blessed by Rome. They marched northward, where forests loomed and rivers ran dark. They razed stone castles, where villages resisted. Their banners advanced, armored horsemen crashing down like thunder. But unlike common raiders, the Teutonic Knights carried a vision, They believed themselves warriors of Christendom, chosen to bring faith and order to lands untouched by the cross. The discipline of the order was absolute. Each knight lived as both monk and soldier. Days began with prayer. Meals were taken in silence, and their armor was as plain as their vows. Yet on the battlefield, they were formidable heavy cavalry, disciplined ranks, their white mantles stark against the smoke of burning villages. To their allies, they were guardians. To their enemies, they were conquerors cloaked in righteousness. And so, a brotherhood born in the deserts of the Holy Land carried its mission into the frozen plains of northern Europe. The Teutonic Order was no longer merely a name, it was a state in the making. A power of stone and steel, destined to shape centuries of Baltic history. Close your eyes, and you can almost hear it, the toll of chapel bells within castle walls, the echo of hooves across frozen ground, and the chant of monks who prayed as knights sharpened swords by torchlight. The Teutonic Order had been born not of tribe, but of faith and war. The Baltic winds howled across endless forests, rivers, and marshlands, but in their midst, a new architecture of power began to rise. Wherever the Teutonic Order planted its banner, stone followed, massive fortress stark, square, and unyielding emerged from wilderness like mountains carved by human will. These castles were not merely walls for defense, they were monasteries, arsenals, courts, and symbols of divine authority. One could imagine riding through a snowy clearing and suddenly beholding Malbork, the greatest of them all. Its red brick towers pierced the northern sky. Its walls stretched like the ramparts of an earthly kingdom of heaven. Within, courtyards echoed with the rhythm of daily prayers, the clatter of armor, the smell of bread baking for both knights and servants. Each corner was ordered, disciplined, a reflection of the vows the Teutonic knights had sworn. Inside the halls, the line between faith and war blurred. By day, knights drilled in formation, horses stamping on frozen ground, squires sharpening lances. By evening, the brothers gathered in the chapel, their chants rising against the vaulted ceilings. They ate in silence, heads bowed, listening to scripture read aloud. For them, discipline was as much a weapon as the sword, and stone was its eternal witness. These castles served as anchors of conquest. Around them, villages of settlers grew, drawn by the promise of protection and land. Roads spread outward, rivers were controlled, and the once wild Baltic frontier bent slowly to the rule of cross and fortress. The Teutonic Order was not merely building castles, it was building a state, each fortress linked to another, like beads on a rosary, securing supply lines and projecting power deeper into pagan lands. To their neighbors, the sight was both awe and dread. Pagan tribes saw in those looming walls the slow strangling of their freedom. Polish and Lithuanian rulers felt the pressure of a new rival, one cloaked in holy authority, yet driven by ambition. And to Rome, the castles were living proof that the mission to spread Christendom was advancing steadily. But within the cold beauty of their fortresses, silence could be deceptive. For every stone laid in faith, another carried the weight of conquest. Behind the chants of monks, there lingered the cries of villages subdued. The castles stood as monuments not only of devotion but also of domination. Still, when night fell and the snows drifted quietly against battlements, there was a certain peace in their endurance. The flicker of torches lit the high walls. Bells tolled into the darkness, and the Teutonic knights prepared themselves for another dawn, another prayer, another battle. The castles of the Teutons remain even now, scattered across Poland and the Baltic. Silent and solemn, they are reminders that faith and stone once intertwined to create a power that seemed as permanent as the earth itself. Yet no fortress, however mighty, is beyond the tides of history. Close your eyes, and you may see it, a lone knight walking across a snow-dusted courtyard, his breath misting in the cold, his footsteps echoing against stone walls that were meant to last forever. The Baltic frontier was a land of thick forests, rushing rivers, and ancient tribes who still worshipped fire and oak, the sun and the thunder. For centuries, the Prussians had lived free, their villages scattered beneath the pines, their rituals whispered in sacred groves. But with the coming of the Teutonic Order, that freedom began to fade beneath the shadow of fortress walls and the thunder of hooves. In the early 13th century, the call came from Duke Conrad of Masovia. His lands lay threatened by raids from pagan Prussians, and he sought a shield, an iron wall of knights who could defend his borders. He invited the Teutonic Order into his realm, gifting them land and papal blessing. It was a fateful choice, for once the Teutons set foot in Prussia, they would not merely defend, they would conquer. The campaigns began with fire and cross. Villages that resisted were burned, sacred groves cut down, and idols shattered. Those who surrendered were baptized at sword's edge, their lives spared only if they bent knee to Christ and to the Order. To the knights, it was a holy mission to bring light into pagan darkness. To the Prussians, it was the beginning of an unrelenting storm. Yet conquest was not only blood. The Teutons built roads, mills, and settlements. German peasants and craftsmen were invited to colonize the frontier, bringing with them new methods of farming, trade, and town life. Slowly, the landscape shifted. Fields replaced forests. Stone chapels rose where fire altars once stood, and German became the tongue of merchants and rulers. The wild frontier was being remade into the fabric of medieval Europe, but the Prussians did not yield easily. Again and again, uprisings flared, warriors striking from the forests, melting away into marshes. The Teutons responded with relentless campaigns, their castles serving as bases for cavalry strikes. Each rebellion was crushed with brutal efficiency, until by the late 13th century, the Prussians were subdued. Entire tribes vanished into assimilation, their names remembered only in chronicles written by their conquerors. For the Teutonic Order, victory meant more than new lands, it meant sovereignty. They were no longer merely guests of Polish dukes or servants of distant popes. In Prussia, they carved their own state, a monastic order that ruled as both priests and kings, its law written in both scripture and sword. From their capital at Malbork, they governed lands that stretched from the Vistula to the Niemen, a realm both sacred and military. Yet every conquest planted seeds of future struggle. The order had risen by subduing tribes, but now they stood as a power in their own right, surrounded by rivals who would not accept their growing dominance. Lithuania still resisted baptism. Poland watched with wary eyes. And far to the west, kings and emperors began to weigh how much authority this monastic state truly deserved. Still, for a time, the conquest of Prussia seemed like destiny fulfilled. The knights of the Teutonic Order rode beneath banners of black crosses, their fortresses unbroken, their state secure. The pagan tribes were silenced, their lands turned to fields and chapels. It was the height of the Teutons' dream, a kingdom built upon both stone and faith. Close your eyes, and you may picture it, the smoke of a Prussian village curling against the sky, the clash of steel in a forest clearing, and beyond it all, the solemn chant of monks within a castle where the cross now reigned supreme. By the late 13th century, the Teutonic Order stood at the height of its power. Castles dotted the Prussian landscape. Villages paid tithe, and German settlers tilled fertile fields where pagan altars once stood. Yet beyond their eastern frontiers remained one land untouched by baptism. One people who refused both sword and cross, the Lithuanians. Lithuania was unlike the Prussians who had fallen before. Their tribes were fierce, their forests deep, and their leaders cunning. They fought not as scattered clans, but as a rising power under ambitious dukes who dreamed of uniting the Baltic under their banner. For the Teutonic Knights, Lithuania was both temptation and threat, the last pagan stronghold in Europe, and the greatest obstacle to their vision of a Christian Baltic. Thus began the Baltic Crusades, campaigns that would last for generations. To the knights, it was a sacred duty. Papal bulls declared indulgences for those who fought against Lithuania, placing their struggle on par with the Holy Land itself. From across Europe, noblemen and adventurers came to join the summer campaigns. French, English, and German knights seeking both salvation and glory in the frozen frontier. Every year, the ritual repeated. In spring, crusaders gathered beneath banners, swore vows, and marched eastward. By summer, they crossed rivers and forests, burning villages, toppling idols, raising crosses. In winter, the campaign ended, armies withdrawing behind fortress walls. Yet when snow melted, the Lithuanians struck back, swift and merciless, harrying supply lines, ambushing patrols, torching settlements. The struggle was relentless. For every Teutonic fortress razed, the Lithuanians answered with raids that tested the knights' discipline. For every village converted, another was lost to fire. Neither side yielded. The order fought with mailed cavalry, their white mantles stark against dark forests. The Lithuanians fought with speed and cunning, masters of ambush, their arrows whistling from the trees before vanishing like mist. And yet, the more they fought, the more the Teutonic dream faltered. Lithuania did not crumble as Prussia had. Instead, it grew stronger. Under leaders such as Mindaugas and later Grand Duke Gediminas, Lithuania expanded westward and southward, forging alliances, absorbing lands, and even flirting with Christianity when diplomacy demanded it. The order, for all its might, found itself locked in a war without end. Still, the Teutonic castles endured. Their walls of brick and stone rose like islands of faith amid seas of pagan defiance. Within their chapels, monks prayed for victory. Within their armories, knights sharpened lances for the next campaign. To Europe, they remained symbols of holy struggle, the last bulwark against pagan darkness. But time was changing. The age of wandering tribes was fading. Replaced by kingdoms and dynasties, Lithuania, once a cluster of clans, was becoming a state flexible, ambitious, and determined. And in their resistance, the Lithuanians forged not only their independence but also their identity. A unity born from defying the Order's relentless crusade for the Teutonic Knights. Lithuania was both obsession and nemesis. They poured generations of wealth, blood, and prayer into subduing it. Yet still the forests burned with resistance. What began as holy duty grew into rivalry of power, a contest that would shape the destiny of both. Close your eyes, and you may hear it, the hooves of knights breaking ice as they cross frozen rivers, the crackle of burning villages, the mournful sound of chants rising from castle chapels, and in the distance, the war cries of Lithuanians echoing through ancient forests. It was more than a crusade, it was a clash of worlds. Faith against freedom. Order against resilience. And though neither side yet knew it, this struggle would one day reach its climax in a single, thunderous battle that would echo across all of Europe. By the dawn of the 15th century, the Teutonic Order seemed to stand like a wall of iron and stone upon the Baltic frontier. Their castles dotted the landscape from the Vistula River to the Niemen. Their treasuries filled with taxes from towns and tithes from villages. Merchants traveled safely along roads guarded by knights, and their harbors hummed with trade. To many across Europe, the Teutonic state appeared invincible. Yet, beneath this surface of strength, cracks had begun to form. The Order's very success had bred rivals. Poland, to the south, watched uneasily as the Teutons extended their grip over contested borderlands. Lithuania, though still partly pagan, had grown into a formidable state under its Grand Dukes, resisting conquest for generations. And when in 1386, Grand Duke Jogaila married Queen Jadwiga of Poland, the unthinkable happened. Lithuania accepted baptism, and a union of Poland and Lithuania was born. For the Teutonic Order, this was a bitter blow. Their holy mission, the justification for centuries of war, had suddenly vanished. No longer could they claim to fight pagans, for their greatest enemy now bore the cross. Yet the knights did not relent. They accused the Lithuanians of insincere conversion, branding them false Christians as a pretext to continue campaigns. But the balance of power had shifted, and the Order now faced a united kingdom more powerful than themselves. Tension flared into open conflict. Border raids turned into wars. and both sides gathered allies. The Teutons relied on their disciplined knights, their castles, and the wealth of their Prussian state. Poland and Lithuania brought vast armies, a blend of heavy cavalry, light horsemen, and infantry drawn from fields and forests. It was a collision of two worlds, the rigid, the monastic order of the knights against the fluid strength of kingdoms bound by dynastic union. Within the walls of Malbork, the Teutonic high masters prayed for victory, confident in their castles and tradition of crusade. Yet whispers spread among merchants and peasants alike. Could the order truly stand against the rising tide of Poland-Lithuania? In town, taverns and village squares, men spoke of looming war, of the day when the might of the Teutons would be tested not in raids or skirmishes, but in a single, decisive battle. And so the road to Tannenberg unfolded. Armies marched, banners unfurled, alliances hardened. The order gathered crusaders from across Europe, eager nobles who sought glory in the Baltic, just as their forebears had in the Holy Land. Poland and Lithuania summoned their levies. The Knights of Kraków riding alongside Lithuanian horsemen, Tatars and Ruthenians. The stage was set for a clash unlike any the Baltic had seen before. The summer of 1410 would bring them together. On fields near the villages of Tannenberg and Grunwald. It was to be more than a battle for land. It was a battle for the very future of the Teutonic Order. A reckoning of faith, ambition, and survival. Close your eyes, and you may picture the scene fields of grain swaying in the July wind, the banners of black crosses and white eagles rising against the sky, the sound of hooves and drums carrying across the plain. The Teutonic knights were marching toward their destiny, and history itself held its breath. The morning of July 15, Itensibaisha, dawned hot beneath a summer sun. On the wide plains near the villages of Tannenberg and Grunwald, two armies gathered, an ocean of banners, steel, and human will. On one side stood the Teutonic Order, their knights armored head to toe, white mantles marked with black crosses, their ranks swelled by crusaders from across Europe. On the other side stretched the allied host of Poland and Lithuania, a coalition of kingdoms and peoples, Polish knights in shining mail, Lithuanian horsemen, Ruthenian archers, even Tatar cavalry from the steppes. The Teutonic Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, rode among his knights with confidence. His army was disciplined, his castles secure, and his faith unshaken. To him, this day would be a final proof of the Order's divine mission. Across the field, King Władysław de Jagiełło of Poland prayed beneath a canopy of trees, while Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania prepared his horsemen for the charge. Both sides knew the stakes. This was no mere raid, but a contest that would decide the fate of the Baltic. As the sun climbed, the battle began. First, the Lithuanians advanced, their cavalry sweeping across the field with speed and ferocity. The Teutonic knights lowered their lances and met them in a thunderous clash. Dust rose, arrows darkened the sky, and for a moment it seemed the Order's heavy cavalry would shatter their foes. But Vytautas had planned well. The Lithuanians feigned retreat, luring the knights into pursuit. stretching their lines thin. In the center, the Polish forces advanced. Banners of the White Eagle fluttering above armored ranks, the Teutons countered with disciplined charges, their steel-clad knights ploughing into Polish lines. For hours the battle raged, the field littered with broken lances and fallen men. The heat was merciless, the fighting unrelenting. Chroniclers would later write that the clash lasted all day, a grinding struggle where neither side would yield. At last, the moment came. The Lithuanians, thought to have fled, returned to the field. Striking the Teutons' exposed flank, the Polish knights pressed forward, their numbers swelling as reserves entered the fray. Surrounded, the Teutonic knights fought with desperate courage. Ulrich von Jungingen himself rode into the melee, determined to rally his brothers. But valor could not turn the tide. He fell amidst the chaos, his banner trampled, his body later found among the heaps of the dead. By evening, the field of Grunwald was silent, save for the cries of the wounded. Thousands lay dead, including much of the Teutonic leadership. The Order's pride had been broken, its aura of invincibility shattered. For Poland and Lithuania, it was a triumph sung in chronicles, a victory that marked their rise as powers of Europe. For the Teutonic Order, it was the beginning of decline, yet even in defeat, the knights left a haunting image. Chroniclers describe their white cloaks stained red with dust and blood, their discipline holding to the last. Their prayers whispered as they fell. They had fought as they lived bound by vows, armored in faith, unyielding until the end. Close your eyes, and you can still feel the tremor of hooves, the clash of steel, the cries of men calling to heaven. Tannenberg was not only a battle, it was a turning point in history, a moment when the might of the Teutonic Order cracked, and the tide of the Baltic world shifted forever. In the years that followed the great defeat at Tannenberg, the Teutonic Order staggered like a wounded giant. Their castles still stood, their banners still flew, but the aura of invincibility was gone. Once, Europe had looked to the Teutons as champions of Christendom. Now, they were spoken of as a power broken, their fate tied to debts, treaties, and uneasy survival. After the battle, the victorious armies of Poland and Lithuania marched on Malbork, the Order's mighty capital. Yet here, behind walls of red brick that seemed to scrape the sky, the knights held firm. Supplies were rushed in, the gates barred, and the siege dragged on. Weeks turned to months, and the attackers could not breach the fortress. At last, they withdrew. Malbork had been saved, and with it the shell of the Order's state. But though the castle stood, the lands around it groaned under ruin. Fields lay burned, villages abandoned, trade disrupted. To recover, the Order was forced to borrow heavily from bankers and to sell privileges to towns and merchants. Slowly, wealth shifted away from the knights and into the hands of burghers and nobles who no longer saw the Order as unshakable masters. Inside the castles, discipline hardened further. Daily prayers, strict vows, endless routine, but outside their walls, The tide of history flowed against them. The 15th century was no longer an age of crusades. Across Europe, kingdoms were rising. Centralized monarchies, wielding armies larger and more flexible than any monastic brotherhood. Firearms and cannons were changing the face of war. And the heavily armored knight was no longer supreme. The Teutonic Order, clinging to its medieval traditions, found itself outpaced by the modern world. Poland and Lithuania pressed their advantage. In the 13 Years' War 1454–1466, towns and nobles within Prussia rose against the order, seeking the protection of the Polish crown. The knights fought bravely, but could not match the resources of a kingdom. When peace was signed at Torun, the Teutonic state was split. Much of western Prussia passed to Poland, while the rest remained under the Order's rule, but now as a vassal to the Polish king. It was a bitter humiliation. Once lords of conquest, the knights were reduced to vassals in their own land. Still, they clung to dignity. Within Malbork's halls, rituals continued as before: meals in silence, prayers in the chapel, armor polished, though it was rarely worn. To visitors, the order presented an image of solemn endurance. Yet beneath the surface, decay spread: financial strain, dwindling recruits, declining morale. The world no longer feared the Black Cross. Instead, it pitied or ignored it. The order that had once brought fire and faith to the Baltic now seemed an anachronism, a remnant of a crusading past in a Europe that looked to trade, diplomacy, and dynasties for power. And yet, there was a melancholy grandeur in their decline. Their castles still loomed. Their chronicles still recorded prayers and battles. They had been shaped by an age of faith and iron, and though that age was passing, the Teutonic knights remained bound to it, like monks locked in stone towers against the rushing winds of change. Close your eyes, and you may picture them, a handful of knights kneeling in Malbork's chapel, candlelight flickering on their white cloaks, while beyond the walls, the world moved on without them. The long decline had begun, and it would not be stopped. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Teutonic Order was a shadow of its former self. Its castles still stood along rivers and plains, but their garrisons were thin, their treasuries drained, and their purpose uncertain. The world had changed. Gunpowder thundered across battlefields. Kingdoms grew centralized under strong monarchs, and the age of Crusades was fading into memory. In 1511, a young nobleman named Albrecht of Brandenburg-Ansbach became Grand Master of the Order. Tall, ambitious, and restless, Albrecht quickly realized that the knights could not survive by clinging to the past. Their lands were squeezed between rising powers, Poland to the west and Lithuania to the east, while within, towns and nobles grew weary of monastic rule. The once glorious order was now an institution at risk of collapse. Then came a force more disruptive than any enemy army: the Reformation. Across Germany, Martin Luther's teachings spread like wildfire, challenging the authority of Rome, calling for faith rooted in scripture rather than ritual. Albrecht listened, and where older knights clung to papal blessings, he saw an opportunity for renewal. In 1525, a momentous change took place. Albrecht, renouncing his vows as Grand Master, converted to Lutheranism. He dissolved the Teutonic state in Prussia, and in its place, he founded the Duchy of Prussia, declaring himself its hereditary duke under the suzerainty of the Polish crown. The transformation was radical. The Black Cross of the crusading knights gave way to the symbols of a Protestant principality. For the order, it was both an end and a beginning. Many knights refused to accept the change, retreating to Germany, Austria, or Lithuania to continue as a religious brotherhood, though greatly diminished. Yet in Prussia, the old dream of a monastic state had died. In its place, a secular duchy arose, one that in time would lay the foundation for the Kingdom of Prussia, and eventually, the power of modern Germany. The castles, once filled with chants of monks and the clatter of armor, now became ducal courts, schools, and centers of administration. Where once knights dined in silence, now dukes hosted banquets. Where once prayers for victory rose, now officials debated law and governance. The Teutonic legacy shifted from holy war to statecraft, from crusading zeal to dynastic ambition. And yet, in this transformation, the spirit of the order was not entirely lost. The discipline, the sense of duty, the austere devotion to cause these values lived on in the fabric of Prussian identity. The iron will of the Teutonic Knights, though stripped of its cloak of faith, found new expression in the emerging modern state. To Europe, it was a striking image, a crusading order, once feared across the Baltic, reborn as a Protestant duchy, navigating the turbulent seas of Reformation and modern politics. To the old knights who had once carried the cross into pagan forests, it must have seemed both betrayal and survival. Close your eyes, and you may imagine Albrecht on that April day in 1525, kneeling before the Polish king in Krakow, laying down the mantle of Grand Master to rise as Duke of Prussia. Behind him, centuries of crusade faded into memory, while before him stretched a new path, one that would carry the legacy of the Teutons into a future they could scarcely have imagined. The Teutonic Knights, once thundering across frozen rivers with lances lowered and banners high, ended their journey not in triumphant conquest, but in transformation. Yet their story did not vanish with the secularization of Prussia. Their legacy, like the stones of their castles, endured through centuries, reshaped again and again by the tides of history. In Germany and Austria, remnants of the order lived on. Though stripped of their state, the Brotherhood continued as a religious institution, serving in hospitals, churches, and charity. They became less a sword and more a cross, an echo of their earliest days as caretakers of the sick in Acre. Even today, the order survives in a modest form, dedicated to faith and service rather than conquest, a living reminder of their complex past. In Eastern Europe, the legacy was more monumental. The castles they built still dominate landscapes in Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. Malbork, their greatest fortress, remains the largest brick castle in the world, a red giant standing silent against the sky. tourists now walk through its echoing halls. Where once the Grand Masters planned campaigns and monks intoned solemn prayers, each stone whispers of discipline, ambition, and the strange blend of faith and power that defined the order. Their memory also lingered in darker tones. To many Poles and Lithuanians, the Teutonic Knights symbolized foreign domination, a force that sought to crush native traditions under the guise of religion. Chroniclers remembered the burning of villages, the forced baptisms, the unyielding march of conquest. For these nations, the victory at Tannenberg was not only military, it was a triumph of freedom over oppression. And yet, paradoxically, the Teutons also left behind seeds of transformation. Their colonization brought towns, trade, and connections to Western Europe. German settlers introduced farming methods, crafts, and laws that tied the Baltic more closely to the continent. Though born in violence, these changes shaped the cultural and economic landscape of the region for centuries to come. Perhaps the deepest legacy lay in Prussia. The duchy, founded by Albrecht, grew into a kingdom, and that kingdom into an empire. The discipline, order, and iron will of the Teutonic tradition infused the Prussian state, and through it, the very character of Germany. In every parade ground drill, every soldier's step, one could glimpse the ghost of the old knightly order that once ruled the Baltic by faith and steel. And yet, for all their power, the story of the Teutons is tinged with melancholy. They rose with zeal, claiming to carry God's will into pagan lands. They built fortresses that seemed eternal, rode as if destiny itself armored their cause. But history, like the sea against stone, wore them down. Their castles remain, their chronicles endure. But their dream of a monastic state vanished into the flow of time. Close your eyes, and their images return knights kneeling in silent prayer. Cloaks of white and black fluttering in northern winds, castles glowing with torchlight as bells toll into the night, armies thundering across the plains toward a battle they believed was holy. Their legacy is both light and shadow, both creation and destruction, an eternal reminder of how human ambition, cloaked in faith, can shape the world and yet be humbled by it. Night falls over the Baltic once more. The forests are quiet, the rivers still, and the castles of the Teutonic Order stand like silent giants beneath the moon. Their walls no longer echo with the chants of monks or the clang of armor. But the stones remember, every brick at Malbork, every crumbled tower along the Niemen, is a page of history that cannot be erased. The Teutons began as wandering tribes, fierce and forgotten, only to be reborn as knights in the deserts of the Holy Land. They built a state upon faith and discipline, raising fortresses where pagan groves once stood. They carved their story in both blood and prayer, and for a time, they seemed eternal. Yet, like all who dream of permanence, they too were humbled. At Tannenberg, the illusion of invincibility was shattered. In Prussia, their monastic state dissolved into the currents of modernity, and still, their spirit lingers. In the drill of soldiers, in the austerity of discipline, in the architecture of brick castles that pierce northern skies, there remains something of the Teutonic soul. Their legacy is not simply conquest or cruelty, nor solely faith and devotion. It is the paradox of human ambition to believe one can shape eternity. Even as time flows relentlessly on, when you wander the courtyards of their fortresses today, you may hear the whisper of the past. The wind rushing through empty corridors sounds like the murmur of monks at prayer. The shadows cast by towers resemble the silhouettes of knights who once kept watch at dusk. They are gone, yet not gone. Their rise and fall remains part of Europe's story. A reminder that no power, however mighty, endures unchanged. Close your eyes now. Let the vision of white mantles and black crosses fade into the night. Let the castles sink back into silence, their stones glowing faintly in moonlight. The Teutons have spoken their tale across centuries, and now it becomes a lullaby. Sleep, and carry with you the lesson they left behind, that strength and faith can build wonders, but that time always has the final word.